1847, Brigham Young led the first of the Mormon pioneers into the valley. The Mormons had a very distinctive set of religious beliefs, and these beliefs had brought them into conflict with the neighbors who they tried to settle next to in Missouri and later Illinois. So the Mormons came out to the west looking for a new home, and they wanted to find a place where they could settle and practice their religion.
Thousands of Mormons, drawn from the poor of the United States, England, and Scandinavia, trekked across the continent to found a new Zion in Mexico's Great Salt Lake Valley to establish a religious community of saints. By 1848, the Mormons occupied an inland mountain fortress where they set up the religiously run state of Deseret, complete with its own currency and army. Distributing land according to family size, the Mormons transformed the arid valley into a rich agricultural oasis by constructing an extensive system of irrigation. The westward migrations brought Americans onto lands claimed by Spain, England, and dozens of Indian nations. Competing claims of sovereignty led inevitably to conflict and quickly became caught up in the raging national debate over slavery. In the American South, the desire for new lands for cultivation was the driving force of westward expansion. With English and northern factories buying all the cotton the South could provide them, planters pushed west across the Mississippi into Louisiana. By 1835, some 30,000 Americans were also living in the Mexican province of Texas.
The Mexicans invited United States citizens to settle in the northern Mexican territories, which at that point included Texas, on condition that the settlers would become Mexican citizens and would become at least nominally Roman Catholic. So Southern slaveholders see this invitation from Mexico as an enormous opportunity to get a lot of territory settled for slavery. Then Mexico abolishes slavery.
When the Mexican government tried to exert greater control over these troublesome newcomers, the Anglos decided to form their own country. In March 1836, Mexican President Antonio López de Santa Anna led an army of 5,000 men to suppress the rebellion and stormed an old abandoned mission called the Alamo in San Antonio. Though suffering some 1,500 casualties, Santa Anna's army wiped out all 187 American defenders, including the legendary frontiersmen Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie. Rallying to the battle cry, "Remember the Alamo," Sam Houston and his Texas volunteers defeated the Mexicans and forced Santa Anna to sign a treaty granting Texas independence. After winning their independence from Mexico, the Texans petitioned for admittance to the United States, but to no avail. Northern congressmen had no intention of admitting yet another slave state into the Union. Believing that continued expansion was vital to the American South, President John Tyler, a Virginian who owned slaves, convinced Congress to annex Texas in March of 1845. Mexico quickly broke diplomatic ties to the United States, and both sides prepared for war. President Tyler's successor, James K. Polk of Tennessee, had run for president in 1844 on a promise of 54-40 or fight, which would have included Western Canada all the way up to the border of Alaska. Meanwhile, out in the Pacific Northwest, the United States and Great Britain were again fighting over borders to lands they had jointly administered for decades. Both lay claim to the resource-rich Oregon Territory. Anticipating war with Mexico, Polk accepted the British offer to divide Oregon at the 49th parallel. Having settled the Oregon issue, Polk provoked a war with Mexico. He offered Mexico $30 million for California and New Mexico. To make sure they sold, Polk ordered federal troops under General Zachary Taylor to enforce American claims to the disputed territory between the Nueces and Rio Grande rivers. Polk then sent a naval squadron to blockade the mouth of the Rio Grande. When news arrived that American troops and Mexicans had battled on the north bank of the Rio Grande, Polk told Congress that Mexico had invaded our territory and shed American blood upon American soil. On May 13, 1846, Congress gave Polk his declaration of war, and American forces invaded Mexico. It took only 6 months to conquer New Mexico and California. Stephen Watts Kearny's Army of the West marched from Kansas to Santa Fe and then on to Southern California. Meanwhile, Zachary Taylor pushed across the Rio Grande, captured the Mexican stronghold at Monterrey, and crushed Santa Ana at the Battle of Buena Vista in northern Mexico. Unable to force the Mexicans to surrender, Polk ordered the conquest of the Mexican capital of Mexico City. Commodore Perry took Veracruz by sea, and Winfield Scott stormed the castle at Chapultepec outside Mexico City, where Mexican cadets as young as 13 and 14 fought and died in defense of the Mexican capital.
Resolved that the present war with Mexico was commenced by the order of the President, with the dismemberment of Mexico, with the triple object of extending slavery, of strengthening slave power, and of obtaining control of the free states. Resolved that such a war of conquest, so hateful in its objects, so wanton, unjust, and unconstitutional in its origin and character, must be regarded as a war against freedom, against humanity, against justice, against the Union, and against the free states. Resolution of the Massachusetts Legislature, April 26, 1847.
The war against Mexico divided Americans deeply. Many Northerners opposed the war on the grounds that it was a pro-slavery conspiracy. Anti-slavery writer James Russell Lowell accused the president of wanting bigger pens to cram with slaves. And a first-term congressman from Illinois by the name of Abraham Lincoln accused President Polk of starting an unnecessary and unconstitutional war against Mexico. Meanwhile, expansionists called Continental Democrats were encouraging the president to take all of Mexico. But support for annexing all of Mexico met stiff resistance. Many Americans did not want the United States to incorporate a Catholic nation of what they called mixed-race people. By the terms of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States took about 1/3 of Mexico's territory, including all of modern California, Nevada, and Utah, most of New Mexico and Arizona, and a large portion of Colorado, 602 million acres in all. 5 years later, Congress purchased the rest of the current-day continental United States from Mexico in the $10 million Gadsden Purchase. On Monday, January 24, 1848, James Marshall discovered gold at Sutter's Mill on the American River near Sacramento, California. This discovery set off a gold rush that attracted fortune seekers from around the world. Almost overnight, San Francisco was transformed from a sleepy port town of about 1,000 people to a booming city of 35,000. Out in the gold fields, a few of the 49ers got rich, but most didn't. Most of the placer, or surface gold, was quickly found. Soon, large-scale mechanized mining took over. Disillusioned, frustrated, and angry, the hordes of prospectors looked for someone to blame. The treaty ending the war with Mexico had guaranteed the citizenship and property rights of the Mexicans who fell under American rule. But in the 1850s, the California legislature passed special land laws that stripped Hispanics of their lands and special taxes against Chinese and Mexican miners who were beaten and driven from the mines. In a matter of years, gold fever had drawn California into the Union. In the coming decades, Western gold strikes would continue to spur settlement and play a major role in financing the nation's economic enterprises and industrialization. The old myth of the American West told of an empty land settled by white men. In truth, all kinds of people lived, worked, and died, creating a new world. Indians, Mexicans, European and African Americans, Chinese, and a host of others intermingled, intermarried, and forged a new society that borrowed from each. As the United States expanded, it redefined its boundaries, both geographically and culturally. American expansion showed the best and the worst in American history, the hard work and courage, the violence and intolerance. Between 1800 and 1860, the United States had expanded from a narrow strip of states along the Atlantic seaboard into one of the world's largest and most prosperous nations. The bountiful resources of the American West had already begun to fuel an industrial revolution. But expansion also created a host of problems.
In the 1840s, where Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas itself, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, an enormous area, is brought in as territory. Population growth is such that some new states have to be admitted. The northern free states are in control of the Congress. And if Congress is in control of the territories will go free state. But if residents are in control, if the people who live in Kansas or the people who live in Arkansas are in control, then the slaveholders, the Southerners, have a chance to settle the territory with slaveholders and bring it in as a slave state.
To reach a compromise between the hardliners in both the North and South, Michigan Senator Lewis Cass called for a doctrine of popular sovereignty. That is, the right of voters to choose for themselves whether their state would be slave or free. What should be the fate of slavery in the new territories? Of the Native Americans and Mexican Americans who lived in the West? Who should own the millions of square miles and invaluable natural resources of gold, timber, and land so recently acquired? What would be the future of the American West? All these were questions yet to be answered.